Hello and welcome to another update. In this one, I'll be covering the latest developments from the front line, starting out in the Zaporizhzhia front, where here the Russian forces have made some minor counterattacks, where they've managed to recapture some territory after the last Ukrainian offensive, which led them to capture major parts here east of Robotyne in the direction of Verbove and actually reaching the first line of defense. Now the Russian forces have pushed them back, and they are essentially back to where they were before. And they've also managed to capture this part east of Robotyne, where here they are also trying to recapture some of the trench networks located around this forest area, which is currently a gray zone as neither side has full control over them, and it is left beyond the front line as heavy artillery is landing there every day, which makes it difficult for anyone to take control over the area. Then we move on to the Pryotne area, which is by the Vermelsky Ledge, where here the Ukrainian forces have managed to push the Russian forces back and have reached very close to the village of Pryotne. So it seems like they will try to attack it directly. And if we take a look at the roads between Stepove and Pryotne, there is one that connects the two. If the Ukrainian forces manage to capture the village of Pryotne, then the supplies to Stepove becomes difficult. So most likely they are trying to cut off the supplies to Stepove unless the Russian forces still have control over this area. The front line itself is very difficult to tell, but it's definitely in an area where it's difficult for the Russians to supply without the Ukrainians actually hitting their supply lines. So most likely the Russians will have to be forced to supply over the fields or to retreat from Stepove and Novoukrayinske to Remivka in case they lose the village of Pryotne. So this actually means that Pryotne is insignificant for the Russians to hold on to prevent such a situation from happening, and as such the Russians will try to focus on holding it and prevent the Ukrainians from advancing and capturing it. Besides that, there is generally a lot of fighting across the whole front line, and we move on to the Svatove area, where here the Ukrainian forces have started their own minor counterattacks here, where they have managed to re-enter the village of Terdovolivka, and they are here trying to push against the Russian forces and their bridgehead across the river line west of Svatove, and here they are attempting to fully recapture this area. Here on Deep State map, we actually see that the Ukrainian forces have managed to recapture the village of Nadia. So they have managed to push the Russians back to this point. And the fighting is now at Novojehorivka and Serhivka, as well as Raihoridvorodka. Generally, the Ukrainian forces have managed to push the Russian forces back in this area. And heavy fighting continues over the control over this area. As I've mentioned earlier, the Russians have a significant troop buildup in this part of the front line. So if they manage to gain a proper foothold across the river line, they can begin stationing their troops from the eastern bank to the western bank of the river line, which would allow them to then launch an offensive in the western direction. So the Ukrainians are here trying to prevent the Russians from holding this area long enough for them to actually start transferring troops across, which would then allow the Russian forces to launch an offensive in this direction. So this is a battle over whether or not the Russians will be able to hold on to the bridgehead across the river line to then launch an offensive. And then moving back to the front line by Zaporizhzhia, there is this video here which shows another mechanized graveyard on the Orihiv area. The geolocation itself I'm not really sure about, but this is said to be a recent one. And we see that there is a lot of vehicles, at least 10 previewed in throughout this video. We see that there is a lot of vehicles scattered around, and most of them seem to have been hit by mines or artillery. We see that they are abandoned and completely destroyed. We also see this video here of allegedly 4 infantry fighting vehicles driving through the north of Robotyne. And here they are driving through a road, and one of them is hit by a mine, and then the 2 others are continuing onwards, and one is missing. This is why I said allegedly 4, because I can only detect 3, but essentially there's one that gets hit by a mine and the others try to go away. Then we have some information that comes from the Ukrainian side. according to one of the UAV commanders of the armed forces of Ukraine, he's complaining about the fact that new electronic warfare technologies from Russia can disrupt Starlink satellite internet, which means that the main form of communication between the Ukrainian forces, as well as a system that they're using extensively for information purposes and reconnaissance purposes, is being disrupted by new electronic warfare from Russia. So this is actually a huge hit for the Ukrainian forces, and it is very difficult for them to adapt to this because essentially they have to detect what type of electronic warfare system the Russians are using, then they have to somehow destroy it. And if the Russians can just produce a lot of these or spread it across the whole front line, it will be very difficult for the Ukrainians to communicate between each other and use the Starlink systems and use their drones as they currently are. He even points out that Starlink is more important to the Ukrainians than even F-16 fighter jets. And then we move on to the discussion of Wagner troops in Belarus. So according to the latest information, we are closing in on the time of Wagner re-entering the conflict. According to Remy Lind, he has been stating from early June all the way to now that Wagner will re-enter conflict on August 5th. Then he also comes with the subnote that no one will give the exact date of when they re-enter, but generally it will happen in August. Yesterday he wrote, Ukrainians, in August there will be a surprise for you. And then he also mentions there are few trainers in Belarus. Already in the next month, the British Secret Service will be in a difficult situation along with the enemy. Incidentally, the Wagners now have even more equipment than they had before they dropped out. So here there are many different things we have to look at. First off, he mentions there are few trainers in Belarus. According to official information and information from reconnaissance and secret services in Belarus, the Wagnerians allegedly only have 4,500 troops in Belarus, spread around the training grounds. This could be the few trainers in Belarus. If that is the case, then most Wagner soldiers are not even in Belarus, which would mean that they are located elsewhere. He also mentions that the Wagners now have even more equipment than what they had before they dropped out. So although there's been this media stunt where they are giving away their equipment to Russia, allegedly they have even more than they had back then. And this is very easy for that to happen because the Wagnerians didn't have a lot of equipment. They had about 2,000 pieces of equipment, which for an army of 50,000 strong is barely nothing. And we also saw that they were mainly used as frontline troops in Bakhmut. So now we may see them take the form of a different formation, maybe more similar to VDV, or even a mechanized division instead of what they currently or previously had, which would indicate that they would be in a position where they are to launch an offensive rather than storming a city, which if we take a look at the front line, there's no real areas that they could storm, except from possibly Avdiivka, but the geography of Avdiivka makes it much more different and more difficult than Bakhmut. Generally speaking, it is unlikely that they'll be doing an operation similar to that of Bakhmut. So this would be a different operation, and as such, they would have a different composition in comparison to what they previously had. There's also the possibility that I'm interpreting the first message wrong, and that there are few trainers in Belarus means something else, and that the Wagner troops are in Belarus. In that case, they would be launching something from the north, but then they would not be enough by themselves. That would only be 60,000 troops, so it would be in combination with other forces. Then we have to take a look at something Remy said a while ago, is that they were already preparing a new meat grinder. In that case, that would be a city, and it had to be close to the front line. So if it is from the direction of Belarus, then it would most likely be Chernihiv or something in that relation. Or it could be in the east, either Sumy or Kharkiv. And it seems that Kharkiv may be the target because there is the fact that Kharkiv is regarded by Russians as a Russian city. especially the ones who are more hardline and the most ones who support this war the most. They are considering Kharkiv similar to Odessa as a Russian city, and in that case they would want to take control of it and annex it and so on. So it would be a primary target if the Russians were to launch an offensive trying to capture more than the 4 oblasts that they have already annexed. Generally, there's a lot of information, but little of it makes sense since they want to keep their operational secrecy. But essentially what is happening is that Wagner is close to returning to the front. It will most likely happen in the month of August, sooner rather than later. And from that, we'll most likely see them take part in some sort of offensive operation. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.